So privileged to have Karina Lester join us. So she's going to be sharing her family story with us. She is a Yankunytjatjara woman from the Western Desert region in South Australia and a second-generation survivor of British nuclear tests that took place in her country at Emu Fields on the 15th of October 1953. Karina just recently attended the COP29 as an ambassador for the Nobel Peace Prize winning organisation, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. And she just got back from the third meeting of the states parties to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the UN headquarters in New York. So very busy, but wonderful that she could join us today. And once again, the chat will just be paused while Karina shares, and then we'll unpause it for people to share reflections afterwards. But Karina, if you're ready, amazing. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Monique, and hope everyone can hear me. Good evening. Can you just bear with me? I've got background noise, so I'll just deal with that.
Yeah,
The background goanna. Welcome, we can hear you well.
Sorry about that. Thank you, everyone, and really grateful for this opportunity. I do want to acknowledge that I am here on Kaurna country, but I'm right up on the APY Lands, up on the very location where the ground shook and the black mist rolled. So this evening, I just really wanted to share some of our family story. It's been a generational story and our many decades of campaigning against nuclear, and this whole new debate and conversation around nuclear power just adds to the story. So I thought I'll just talk a little bit about Dad's story in particular, because I think that's where things really started for me as well. So my late father, Yami Lester, was born on Yankunytjatjara country, and as a young boy witnessed the first mainland test that took place at Emu Field, roughly 160 kilometres south from Walajara, which is his traditional lands. And it was there that he and his family, and it was a pastoral property. So he was growing up as a young boy, watching his parents sort of do their work around the station. Nana would have been doing some domestic work around the homestead, washing clothes and cleaning the homestead, helping Mrs. Cullinan, and Dad and his family, like father, would have been doing a lot of work on the station. So that was how the morning kind of started back then on the 15th of October 1953. And then soon after, things changed quite dramatically then when that first detonation of that Totem 1 took place south from that traditional lands, from Dad's country. And so the old homestead where the house is now today, just roughly maybe a kilometre, 2 kilometres, were the old shelters where many of the Arno, Dad's family, were living there at that time. And so things, as I said, changed quite dramatically by that late morning, by evening time, or that afternoon as well, and into the evening, where many people at that time in the sand dunes witnessed this black mist rolling towards them. And so it was quite, you could only imagine the fear when people, when families saw this black mist rolling silently towards them through the tops of the trees and along the ground, to this beautiful sand dune country, which the old shelters are still standing today, and you can still see them. So quite a beautiful place, and you can see how people would live in that area there, and they'd walk down from the sand dune to the homestead where they do the domestic work then, and Dad and his fathers would be doing, all the station work then as well. So, that day on the 15th of October, things changed. By evening time, people became quite ill from radiation fallout, but it took Dad 30 odd years after Totem 1 before we really got some good answers, or got answers to what took place. And that was because Dad had heard a ABC radio interview with the gentleman by the name of Sir Ernest Titterton, who was on ABC, saying that they had taken good care of the blackfellas. And Dad was listening to this particular interview, and I think it was that interview that really triggered him then to go, hang on a minute, that wasn't the case. At Emu Field, many of us became quite ill, and a lot of the elderly who were quite weak were the ones that really felt the fallout over their traditional lands, and many of them elders had passed. And so we've got a lot of oral history stories of my grandmothers burying their parents, which, you know, you can only imagine how tragic and how traumatising that experience would have been. And Nana Angelina Wanga spoke about that in part of her testimony as well. So as I said, 30 years later was the time when Dad really got some sort of answers, and that was through the pushing of a royal commission into the British nuclear testing, and that was the McClellan Royal Commission. And through that process, they struggled to prove that the radiation fallout had impact on his blindness, because Dad lost his sight soon after 1953, and it would have been roughly 1957 when Dad might have been 15, 16, because he was born in the bush, so really didn't have a birth date, but, you know, give or take a couple of years. So at that very young age was when his eyesight went on him, and at that age of 16, his world turned into complete darkness then. And I, as a mother of 4, and my youngest son is 17, I get quite overwhelmed with that as well, to think that as that young boy, that's how old Dad was when his world turned into complete darkness. So, you know, he certainly was, I think, dealt the short straw. You know, when you think of Dad, I think of the amazing young man that he would have been, working and enjoying on country and being out there in the open with his, you know, family, and working on the pastoral property, and, you know, enjoying being on country and learning his traditional ways and speaking his language and practicing law and culture. And all of a sudden, on, you know, not his blame or not his acts, but because of somebody else's, which is government, of course, who made the decision to conduct those nuclear tests, the Australian government and, of course, the British government. So, you know, it wasn't of Dad's era. But I think that was, after hearing that interview, he was certainly determined then to get some sort of justice and talk about what took place and remember what had taken place as well. And so he pushed very hard for that Royal Commission, and they were very lucky to, you know, be able to give their testimonies, which was really important for, you know, Dad to be able to talk about what happened back then on the 15th of October 1953, but he also made it happen that McClelland was able to be on country, who was the commissioner, made the effort to come to Wallatina, to Walladjara, and take the evidence from Arnaljuda at that time, and to hear, you know, their stories and their recollections. And so, you know, Nana's testimony spoke about a really strong smell, like a toxic smell. Nana Gumbwater spoke about skin rashes and sore eyes and, you know, strong smell and this feeling of this thickness that fell over, which was later in that Royal Commission they found out was radiation fallout over Wallatina. And so when you have a lived experience, and, you know, as people would know, I'm a second generation survivor of those British nuclear tests, you feel that you have a obligation, and I think Dad did back in the day of really talking about this nuclear injustice and, you know, voices not being heard and the way that they treated Anangu, because, you know, we were so isolated and we didn't have access to any medical services. We were hundreds of kilometres away from Ernabella Mission, where probably the mission had a doctor that may have been able to see. We're roughly 200 kilometres west of Yankunytjatjara, so we would have had to travel 200 kilometres east to get to Yankunytjatjara, which is where the railway line was, to then try and get to maybe down to south, Port Augusta way, to get any sort of medical attention. So very isolating and no real access to any services, and especially medical services, soon after that radiation fallout over community and over Dad's traditional lands. So people were really, you know, really badly done by, because elders passed, Dad started to experience the sore eyes, and then at that young age his world turned into complete darkness. So, and through that Royal Commission process, we could only prove, or Dad could only prove, that it was radiation fallout, and that Wallatina had the highest radiation fallout from that first test, that first mainland test. So, you know, this is a story that's been with us for decades now, and it's kind of moved into other areas and, you know, other issues that are being raised because of nuclear, whether it's nuclear waste dumps, and that's where Nana Gumbawatta mob came heavily involved in the time in the Gubabiri Gungayuda, and then Howard government was pushing for a nuclear waste dump, and so Nana mob got in quite active and got, you know, vocal and concerned, because it was part of their cultural responsibility and looking after country as well. And they had knowledge, great knowledge of country, and they were very concerned and very worried about waste dump and what that might have impact wise on community and on their lands, on their traditional lands. And so, you know, they formed back in the late 90s, 98, the Gubabiri Gungayuda, who really led a solid campaign then against the Howard government to, you know, block the waste dump. But then, you know, fast track a couple of years, we were dealing with another push for a waste dump issue as well, which would have been our state government in South Australia, and it was under the Jay Weatherill leadership. He was our Premier at the time, but he was also pushing for a Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, which is where I came quite active then in that work. I kind of helped Nana in the Irarewandi campaign to get Nana's voice out, and that was part of the role that I saw my father play as well, in being the bridge between, you know, commissioners and lawyers and understanding the legal process, and then was able to interpret to Yankunytjatjara and get Yankunytjatjara on side, his people on side, to be able to speak in Yankunytjatjara, Pitjantjatjara, and then share those stories as well. So he played this role of communicator between two cultures, and I took that role on in the Irarewandi campaign with Nana Gumbawatta mob, and, you know, played that role, and then stepped into this Royal Commission role. And, you know, I remember my late sister, Rose Lester, who said to me, "Sis, I don't think I've got the energy to fight this one." And I said, "Look, I think we just need a tag team." And, you know, this hasn't been a job that we want to take on. We've got other things happening. We've mothers we are, and we're raising our children, but these things came up, and that was one of the heavy tasks for both my sister and I, where, you know, we had to be actively involved against the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, and people like Jim was heavily involved supporting us as well. And we really worked hard and formed networks and, you know, build good working relationships with the unions and education unions and other Aboriginal groups as well in South Australia. But the main thing was that we were there as in the Indigenous voice, And our Aboriginal Voices of South Australia were there at the very beginning of that whole Royal Commission. But we had to push our way through, and that's the role that I kind of played in trying to get in there to say, hang on a minute, Aboriginal voices are so important in this Royal Commission and you need to hear us, and we are part of this conversation. And, you know, I was able to get Aboriginal people of South Australia involved, and we were able to, you know, be right there front and centre in the whole process. And, you know, sharing crazy experiences I did with my my sister, my late sister, and then a cousin of ours as well. You know, and funny, overwhelming experiences, and we called it speed dating, but we were giving evidence of the reasons why Aboriginal people of South Australia say no, and to share our personal story to 100 jurors each, because there was 300 jurors who were in this whole Royal Commission process through Democracy Co. And we each had 100 jurors to, again, tell our stories as we rotated around. So these were really overwhelming experiences that, you know, my cousin actually wrote a paper about it as well, about you know, the process. Not very many Aboriginal people, and especially countrymen, like, you know, my grandparents and then possibly even Dad wouldn't, you know, feel comfortable in a space like that to go around with 10 jurors in groups of 10, so 100 jurors, to talk about the reasons why. You know, it's such a uneven playing field. But gratefully, you know, for my sister, my older sister, and then also our cousin, we were successful in actually sharing our stories and participated in this process. So that was the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle. And then, of course, over the years, the waste dump kept coming back to South Australia, and we've needed to support one another as well. And as some of you, and I'm sure you all know, that there was the Kimber waste dump issue that went down, and they were successful. But again, it was a court process. And so, again, taking people's time and energy, and, you know, bringing up the trauma again and talking. And the role that we played was to stand in solidarity with the Bungalow community and, you know, their Aboriginal corporation, and to really say, look, you do have the support of Aboriginal groups of South Australia, as well as you do your struggles through, you know, a legal process. So, you know, they were successful, and we were very pleased with that as well, and the outcome of that court case as well. But of course, you know, as we all know, and what's on the table now is the talk of nuclear power plants. And I had come back from Baku, November last year. I'd travelled over there for the climate conference, climate change conference, and that was around November. And soon after coming back from there, I was a witness to the inquiry that was run by the Commonwealth Government around the nuclear fuel cycle. And I think I was kind of exhausted from Baku, because that was such an overwhelming experience being over there. And there was a delegation of Aboriginal women who were kind of involved in this process, supported by Get Up, the organisation, who really brought this amazing delegation of Aboriginal women from, you know, across Australia, who were really concerned about climate. And of course, I, you know, said, this is my story. I'm coming in with this, you know, need to stand up and talk about the impacts of nuclear testing in, you know, our country, on our Yankunytjatjara country. And I was an affected community. And so we really campaigned, and I travelled across over there with Dave Sweeney, who's a part of ACF, Australian Conservation Foundation. And both he and I went across there to really voice our concerns around the nuclear issue and this debate that's on the table now about nuclear power, which, you know, we're all discussing now. So we went there, and what was overwhelming was those pro-nukers were actually given time and space to talk up about nuclear power being the solution to climate change. That was quite overwhelming, because we, as those who coming from affected communities, were quite overwhelmed by the fact that these pro-nukers were given airtime, and that space was quite challenging because many people were, you know, hearing that side of the story, and David actually tried to spend time and listen in that area and to kind of understand where they're coming from, and then also, you know, knowing the stories of what us as Aboriginal people and you know, those that are affected communities globally, and our stories that we share all the time of the trauma and the loss. You know, how do you try and find some sort of balance in there? That was overwhelming. I was fortunate enough to do some press, so that was press conferences, so that was a good opportunity to sort of speak up more about myself as from representing impacted communities in South Australia. And then, you know, that was a good experience. But then I came back, and then I evidence in the Royal Commission, or not what Royal Commission, it was the inquiry then after I got back from Baku around the reasons why Aboriginal people, you know, have said no and always will say no around nuclear and nuclear power. And so, you know, I was fairly strong because I'd come back from Baku, and I think I was exhausted from that experience, and then I was ready to kind of say, look, we're not interested as Aboriginal people, and we are the most consulted people, and still you are not hearing. We have gone through processes over the decades when you look back at that timeline, you know, the reasons why. Dad's Royal Commission, Nana's campaign against the Iradiwandi, the waste dump, the Royal Commission into the nuclear fuel cycle, and we were successful. And we were blocking waste dumps and speaking up about the Royal Commissions and, you know, why we say no to nuclear. And that was what I thought, you know, you're not listening, and this idea of nuclear power is not the solution to climate change. And so
Yeah.
I gave that evidence to that, and that was you know, a good opportunity. And then, of course, recently I've just come back from the third meeting of the states parties, speaking up again with affected communities, and us as communities globally networking around, you know, this issue, on making sure that our voices are front and centre in this whole debate around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and pushing my country, Australia, to sign and ratify this treaty as well. So, you know, a lot of work happening, but this is not my daytime job. You know, this is a personal thing that I've kind of stepped into in honour of my late father, Yami Lester, and the legacy that he's left, who spoke up about, you know, the harms of nuclear testing in our Yankunytjatjara country. So, you know, it's a generational story now, and I can say that because I'm a mother of 4. And this is a story that they need to take on as well. And I was very lucky to take my youngest son, William, with me to New York, for him to sort of see how the whole UN and this important work around the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is really important. And he met a lot of people over there, especially from affected communities, which was overwhelming and you know, important for me as a mother to make sure that he knows what happens, but knows his story, and hopefully one day can continue on as the next generation. Or if we are successful and Australia signs in the treaty, then, you know, he doesn't have to be too active in the space as I have been over the decades now. So, you know, hopefully I haven't gone over time, but thank you, Monique, and thank you for the invite to just share a little bit of our story, you know, as a second generation survivor of the British nuclear tests.